Hello everyone. So, a few days ago, the most popular stream on YouTube in the world was one featuring Sargon of Akkad and Richard Spencer, figurehead of the alt-right Richard Spencer, as well as some others, but those were the two important participants. Now, Sargon failed to lay out a case defending individualism from the racial collectivism Richard Spencer advocates. And so what I'm going to do here in this video is comment on some of the most important things Spencer said and give the correct responses to them, which Sargon couldn't do because he's not an objectivist and doesn't have an objectivist understanding of things like rights and individualism and capitalism. So these will mostly be clips of Richard Spencer, and then I will respond to him. I'm using him as a backboard. So you're going to see the responses that should have been given to Richard Spencer, which he can't answer because my view, the objectivist view, is the correct one.
Yeah, I think conservatives are wrong from the beginning because their starting point, as they articulated it in the mid-1950s, was the Cold War. So it was an image of the United States as a counter-Soviet Union, as a capitalist global empire. Their starting point was free market economics, capitalism, effectively. And their starting point was individual liberty. So it was a liberal starting point, you could say, and a Cold War starting point. The starting point that for the alt-right is identity. And there's another term that I've certainly adopted that I did not invent that comes from France actually, which is identitarian. And it is that notion that before one thinks about foreign policy, before one thinks about economics, before one thinks about anything else, one has to answer that question: who am I and who are we? What am I part of? What is this extended family that I am at home with? And that is identitarianism in a nutshell. It's that you ask that question first. American conservatives in the mid-50s with William F. Buckley and so on never ask that question. They never seriously inquired into race. They vaguely inquired into religion, but they certainly never seriously inquired into what America is as a European nation and who they are as Europeans.
The first thing to do, if you are ever discussing the alt-right and identitarianism, is to refuse to use the term identitarianism. That is not a valid term. It is the same thing as racism. It is another word for the same thing. What does identitarianism mean? It means the idea that the race is both the standard of value, whatever is good for the racial collective, is what every individual should aim for. So the group is the primary unit of existence, and what benefits it is the standard of value, and the view that all individuals receive their characterological nature from being part of the group. It's determinism. You are the way you are because you're a part of this racial group. It's a form of genetic determinism. It's just tribal and perceptual level. So that is what identitarianism means, and that is all racism means. So don't let them use this word. Use racist, use racism. Look, I'm an objectivist. I don't run away from selfishness. Why? Because I know people are against selfishness in large part because of what it actually means. They don't want you to go pursue your own career instead of take care of your sick grandmother. They're against actual selfishness. And I don't come up with some new word in order to try to get around that. No, I beat people over the head with it. I'm selfish. I'm for selfishness. I don't run from that. But the alt-right are cowards. And so they won't use these words and want to play these games because they're afraid of coming at things straight. Now, the second thing about this word is, it's also just non-essential. What, so they're pro-identity, and what, that implies I don't care about identity. People who are against racial identity don't care about identity? No, identity is not the essence there. Other people care about identity. I care about identity, but my view is that identity comes from your chosen values. It's how you've chosen to think. It's the character you have built into your soul through repeated action and thought and the values you've pursued. That's your identity. We're beings of self-made soul. You choose how to act and you build your habitual nature out of that. You build your, what Ayn Rand called psychoepistemology out of that, your characteristic way of thinking and coming at the world. And you do that by acting in reality in pursuit of certain goals. So you choose your values and the virtues that you act on in order to attain those values. That's your proper identity. So I'm not anti-identity, I'm anti-racial identity as fundamental. It's trivial at best. So calling it identitarianism is not just cowardly, it's non-essential. It doesn't make sense. You're not for identity. That's not what distinguishes you. You're for race as the fundamental aspect of identity. So call yourself what you are, racists.
And I think we've basically seen the end result of this, which is a conservative movement that just slowly floated leftward, that was based in abstract values like free market capitalism, which could be used to justify things like the Iraq War or what have you, that it was just this free-floating ideology that floated leftward, that floated this way and that floated over to Iraq in some cases, and just became a total disaster and didn't conserve anything. A conservative has to conserve something. A conservative is ultimately a collectivist in that sense. A conservative is someone who is conserving his class, his people, the state itself. He is an institutionalist in that sense. It's actually the left that is individualistic. Even when the left attempts to use collectivist economic means, it's still in the name of individualism. It's still in an attempt to reach a deracinated, pure individual who is not weighed down in the leftist mind by community, by history, by race, religion, the past, the one's duty to the future, etc. So the left is fundamentally individualist. This is the problem with American conservatives. They get this fundamentally wrong. They'll we're individualists. The ISI is a stupid fuddy-duddy group for closeted homosexual Catholics or conservatives, I guess. And it used to be called the International, or the Individualist Society Institute or something, some nonsense like that. Society of Individualists. They always wanted to base their belief system in the individual and individualism. That is fundamentally wrong. Man is, as a political animal, man is a social being. He's part of a greater family. He's part of a past and a future. He is part of an identity that is bigger than any individual. And so the starting point for the alt-right is that question: who are we? Who am I? Identity.
The left is not fundamentally individualist. Now, he's right to make a distinction between the left, we'll say socialists, and himself, and the alt-right, but it's the difference between Kant and the Oriental mystics. It's not that they're fundamentally different, it's that at least Kant was still paying lip service to reason, inconsistently using it even. Yes, the left will pay lip service to individualism, but that's not what they're actually aiming for. Yes, they claim, well, we're doing this for individualism. Ultimately, sometimes they say that, although they very often don't. This is just a dishonest way of trying to appeal to people who consider themselves right by saying, oh, well, you were really collectivists all along. That's really the nature of your ideas because the left are individualists. No. The left are just not the naked collectivists Richard Spencer is. And fine, differentiate yourself. But that doesn't change what the left fundamentally is. They fundamentally are collectivist. They just have derivations that aren't consistent with that essence. Whereas Richard Spencer is more consistent. More consistently wrong.
So that's very interesting, this interaction between individualism and the left and the opposition that you proposed there. I remember Sargon of Akkad being surprised at me, stating that I was not so much of I'm a libertarian, but I'm not so much of an individualist, because I recognize that individuals can adhere to groups. They can use their liberty to adhere to groups, and then the group can become a very important aspect of their identity. Would you define as a libertarian? And do you see, just like me, that there's no transgression there between being a libertarian and not being an individualist?
Eschewing libertarian for freedom-oriented, because libertarian doesn't mean anything and they are pathetic and don't stand for anything coherent. But if you mean a system of freedom, of individual freedom, can be reconciled with a collectivist worldview, no, it can't be. For the same reason religion can't be reconciled with capitalism. Now, you can have religious people and collectivists in a capitalist system, but the point is, those ideas, what is contained in them, if worked out, will overthrow capitalism, because it's inconsistent with capitalism. Now, that doesn't mean you censor them. Then you're just immediately throwing away freedom. But it does mean you have to combat it. And it does mean if you take collectivism seriously, then you're going to realize that capitalism is not the system that implements your values. There is no logic by which you can go from, the group has a claim over me, and yet it should still respect my rights to act independent of what it wants me to do. That is obviously inconsistent. So no, you cannot be a capitalist, pro-freedom, libertarian, and a collectivist.
Sure, I'm not a libertarian. I think a lot of libertarian energies in the United States were masked conservatism. So many people who claim to be a libertarian simply wanted to get the welfare state off their back, thought that the welfare state was pro-black or anti-traditional values, and maybe they were right about that. And so they were anti-government more than they were truly libertarian. And their idea was that we would get rid of the state and then these communities would flourish. This is a kind of right-wing libertarianism. You could see this in a lot of the people who got behind Ron Paul and people in the Mises Institute or so on. There is a left-wing libertarianism which does not really come from that basis, that thinks that the individual is sacrosanct, that we need to ever expand what individuality means. But no, I am not a libertarian in the sense that, though I oppose many actions of the government, I think the state is an existential entity. There will always be a state. One entity will be sovereign. One entity will be able to use violence. And the question really is what and who? Who is in charge of this existential entity, the state? And so I am not a libertarian in that sense, although, maybe in a basic sense I'm a libertarian, less government or whatever, but not in a crucial and fundamental sense.
See, Richard Spencer understands what his ideas lead to, and they do not lead to libertarianism. Now, there's also the problem here of intellectual libertarianism, which just means anarchism. And this is where Spencer gets part of his plausibility, because he's arguing against people with massive flaws. So if you're an anarchist, that is incoherent. And Richard Spencer is rightly pointing out, well, you're not going to get rid of the state. That's a stupid idea. So the real question is just who's in charge of the state? So if you really think that freedom means no state, then there's no such thing as freedom. So we should just drop that fantasy and just talk about which thug is going to be in charge. Well, if you're a libertarian, a real libertarian, you have no argument against that.
You obey traffic laws and you pay your taxes, you more or less, I would assume you do. You are effectively obeying a group right. I mean, a corporate entity that is the United Kingdom or some province within it has power over you. So this whole group rights question is, I think, rather autistic in the sense that it's dissociated from lived reality.
I will get back to this stupid, equivocal conception of rights in a second, but first I just want to point out how lame and pandering it is for him to use the word autistic. First of all, it's evil to use that word if you know what it actually means. I mean, not what it actually means, but what it means in internet lingo. And Spencer's just trying to appeal to the dumb internet right-wing fascist mob, the new right, the young racists. white racists, because there are a lot of young anti-white racists. But that's who he's trying to appeal to. He knows where his bread is buttered. He is pandering here by using stupid, hip internet lingo. Now, what's evil about calling someone autistic is, what does it mean? It's a naked assault on being rational. It's like calling somebody a nerd. It's an attack on intelligence, on reason, on scrupulous thought, on precision. When somebody accuses you of being autistic, what he's really saying is, why can't you just understand what we're getting at? Why can't you just go with the social vibes? Why do you need everything to be so precise and abstractly logical? Can't you just go along with it? It's really just another step. People are now emboldened. They are actually explicitly attacking abstract thought. Spencer does this a lot here, but that's what people mean when they use autistic. It's, why can't you just go with the social vibe? Why do you need all these precisely articulated abstract rules and communications? If I tell you to do something, you just know. You just know. They do this later. I don't have this clip in here because it's not essential, but they do this later. They talk about, well, who's white and who's not white, and they're just rolling their eyes. Oh, who cares? You just know if somebody's white or not. It's not a big deal. This is their whole thing. And of course it is. This is how the Nazis were. This is blood and soil. Their whole worldview pertains to the viscera. It's not rational. It's not logical. It's just, you just feel what's right. So it's no wonder cretins like Spencer and the alt-right are attracted to words like autistic. It's an anti-rational insult.
There are going to be competing versions of the world for who is going to rule the planet after the fall of the American empire. Muslims have an idea. They have an idea of what they want to see. I don't want to see that. And there's going to be, the Chinese have an idea, which has certain advantages and many disadvantages, to say the least. There are going to be competing visions of who will rule the planet after the fall of the American unipolar world. And what I am saying is that we need our vision, that those who have a passion and a will to implement a vision are going to be the winners in this. If we decide to all be individualistic liberals and say, oh, we don't want to play that game, we're so afraid of the state, we're so afraid of violence that we don't want to play that game, those people will ultimately be slaves. Those people will ultimately be subjugated to those who are willing to use the state, willing to use force, and who have a bold vision of the future and the will to enact it.
And Richard Spencer accuses other people of being in the ethereal, abstract realm disconnected from reality. So, well, I guess this is why Germany won World War II, right? Because, I mean, being that kind of barbaric, tribal collectivist, that's the most practical thing to do, right? I mean, if you respect people's freedom, if you're an individualist country, how can you defend yourself, right? I mean, well, let's look at America. Let's see, the nation of the Enlightenment, founded on a constitution with the explicit purpose of defending individual rights, made possible technology and wealth that in turn made possible the greatest military in history, and a situation in which any state actor that directly attacks the United States is committing suicide. That has never existed before. The United States could take on the entire world by itself and still win. But no, it's impractical to be individualistic and free. Obviously, freedom, because it enables people to use their rational minds to develop technology, to make our lives better in this world for selfish reasons, leads to better defense, and in fact, it leads to people wanting to defend themselves more. Volunteer armies are much more practical than armies of slaves. So we see that freedom works to produce the technologies and attitude that lead to self-defense. The idea that collectivism is going to lead to some kind of, even spiritually, some greater willingness to self-defense, no. I'm afraid that's the same mistake altruists make. Guess what? You're safer in an elevator because the guy operating the building has a selfish reason to keep you safe in there. Not because some altruistic public elevator inspector came and he cares about you for altruistic reasons. No. Same thing here. People care about defending their country when their country benefits them, when their country aligns with their selfish interests. A country that sacrifices you to the collective does not inspire the kind of practical mentality you need to fight wars of self-defense. So one, you can just look at America and really any free country. They are technologically more advanced and incomparably better able to defend themselves than collectivist countries. And then you can look at collectivist countries. I mean, maybe Germany would have won. Hitler probably would have gotten the atomic bomb if he hadn't killed all of the smartest people in the country, the Jews, for racist reasons. So I can't believe I have to explain how racism is impractical, how any kind of collectivism is impractical for self-defense. It led to Hitler killing all of the smartest people who could have developed the bomb for him. But he put his irrational ideology over reality. And of course, what happens when you put irrational ideas ahead of reality and then you act on those irrational ideas is that you come into conflict with reality, which for Hitler meant a bullet in the head administered by himself after he had utterly failed, for predictable reasons if you're not a racist moron. So America, freest country in the world based on the Enlightenment, has a military that cannot be challenged by anyone, and on the other hand, Nazi Germany failed to get the atomic bomb because it killed all of its smartest people because it was racist. Because it was racist. I don't think an honest person needs to hear any more than that to make up his mind on this issue.
I agree with you that collectives have more power than the individual, which is basically what you're saying. This is my critique of a lot of the libertarianism that I've heard tonight, is that it seems to exist in an abstract plane in which we want to ask moral questions about should a group have a right over an individual. The fact is, in lived reality, obviously groups have more power than individuals, and obviously corporate entities, whether they be governments or even Silicon Valley companies or what have you, have power over the individual. Obviously, these rights,
we have
in terms of having more power, supersede them.
You've actually
the
hit
whole
on
point of
really
rights. So then you're admitting that their rights
on the reason
supersede
why
the
we
individual.
need individual rights. It's because of the disproportionate power of entities that don't have any legitimate claim to control an individual or violate their rights.
Why does an individual have a claim to this sanctity of not being controlled? Why does an individual have a claim to some kind of sanctity of not being controlled by a collective?
And now we get back to the fundamental question of rights here. Now, you see, Richard's conception of rights is that you have a right to do something if you can do it. For him, right just means something you have the power to do. No, that's stupid. Rights are moral concepts. They are about what you should do. Yes, it's true. They're not these metaphysical force fields. Your rights can be violated, but that doesn't change the nature of what happens if they are. So a right is just a way of saying, you should respect people's freedom of action in a social context, because that's the only way you get life and happiness. So he acts like it's this ethereal, abstract thing, it doesn't really exist. No, it's a hard, solid, factual statement of cause and effect. Freedom causes survival and happiness. I call that together human flourishing. Other people use human flourishing in a slightly different way, or maybe a less specific way. I use it to refer to the virtuous cycle of survival leading to happiness, and then the reward of happiness motivating further survival. So it's this cycle. It's life and happiness. And freedom is what causes that. That's what rights refer to. It's not a mystical imposition or supernatural commandment. It's not a subjective thing we just make up. It's a factual thing. Now, you can argue about whether life and happiness should be the goal, and about whether freedom is how to get there. But the essential point here is that it is a factual question. Given a goal, you can't get there in any way whatever. If you have a goal, you have to take specific actions to get there. Some actions will lead you there, some actions won't. So what Wright just says, if you want to achieve this goal, then you should not interfere with people's freedom in these ways. That's what individual rights are based on. It's just a factual statement of cause and effect. Now, what Richard is trying to say is this. This is exactly the equivalent, just in your personal life, not in politics. Richard Spencer eats junk food all day. 10 cakes a day. Horrible diet. So I come to him and I say, hey, Richard, you shouldn't eat like that. You should get on a better diet because it will make you healthier. It will make you feel better. It will cause you to live longer. So you should get on this better diet. And he says, should? All these abstract questions, all this morality. The fact is, I do eat all this junk food. I can eat all this junk food. So what are you coming and trying to tell me that I should eat this other way? Well, obviously, I'm not saying you have to eat that other way, in the sense that it's possible for you not to, but you should if you want to feel better and live longer. The fact is, people can act in different ways. Richard implicitly agrees with this by being on an intellectual debate stream. Presumably, he is hoping to persuade people to think and therefore act in ways differently than they already do. So the point of arguing for individual rights is people and governments can act in different ways, and we are trying to persuade people to institute a government, strengthen a government, cause the government to act in ways that protect people's freedom of action, which is what leads to happiness. That is possible. It's possible not to be like that. People can act in different ways. Saying, well, but they don't act like that right now. That doesn't say anything. So they don't have to, and they shouldn't. And individual rights are just a statement of, look, if you act this way, you're not going to get human life and happiness. You're not going to get human flourishing. So if you want human flourishing, you have to leave people free. That's not some ethereal, non-existent moral thing. No, morality is just statements of cause and effect. It's if you want to survive and be happy, then you have to do these things, and that has implications for politics. And the main implication there is freedom. As a side note, it's funny, Richard keeps talking about, the abstract things he says in other parts of this video. Where has this society of freedom ever existed? There are always aristocracies, there's always power. He talks about obeying laws earlier, as if obeying laws is collectivist, inherently collectivist. No. A law against murder is not collectivist. That protects people's rights to live the way they want to live. A law against charging exorbitant interest, that is collectivist. The fact of government is not a collectivist thing. The fact is, you can have a government that acts to protect your ability to live the way you want to live, or a government that acts to dispose of you for some greater or collective good, for the people, the race, God, your own noumenal self-interest, but it acts in place of your judgment. It's possible for the state to act like that. It's possible for the state to protect your rights. These are two possibilities. But Richard Spencer is trying to elide the differences here and just say, well, they're all collectivists, so it doesn't matter. Okay, then what are we even talking about? No. Now he says, well, where has this state ever existed? But then later he admits his own ideal state hasn't ever existed. Now, it wouldn't even matter if we were in a capitalist paradise and nothing like what Richard Spencer wants had ever existed. I would still totally admit that it's possible. It won't have the results he thinks it will, but it's possible for people to act in different ways, for governments to act in different ways. So you hear this all the time. Oh, well, it's never existed. So what? We can see that it's possible based on the fact that people can act in different ways, and we've had different degrees of things, so you can easily extrapolate out from that. It's like saying, well, I personally haven't died yet, so maybe I can't die. Well, you have enough evidence to know you can, so don't go stabbing yourself in the neck on the grounds that, well, we've never seen me die. How can you say that? No. You've seen yourself get injured. You know you can be more and less healthy. So you just extrapolate from there. So this is just dumb. I hate when people use this stupid argument. It hasn't existed, therefore it never can. Well, there was a first time everything new existed. That doesn't mean you can go and arbitrarily postulate things for which you have no evidence. But if you have evidence of something in principle and you can extrapolate from there, then it's totally fine and possible. But now, back to this idea of why is freedom required for human flourishing? Why do we need to be free? Why won't collectivism, racial collectivism even, satisfy people's psychological desires? Now, I know Richard Spencer is at least in part relying on this idea because I think he actually uses the term flourishing. So he is in some sense justifying his ethno-state on the grounds that it will lead to human happiness and psychological satisfaction. In order to explain why freedom leads to happiness, or is required for happiness, I'm going to get into some basic biology. And I know the alt-right loves biology, or at least their pseudo-scientific version of it. But here's some real biology. The reason happiness and survival depend on freedom is that plants don't have consciousness. What do I mean by that? Well, why don't plants have consciousness? Why aren't they aware? It's because they don't act. They're stationary. Animals move around. They act in a world of discriminated, three-dimensional entities. They move around to get their food and do all the things they need to do to survive. In order to be able to do that, they need a perceptual level consciousness. And they need a pleasure and pain mechanism in order to motivate their actions. Now, if they didn't need those things, they would atrophy, go away. They wouldn't have them. They would be like plants. The reason they have the ability to feel pleasure and pain and to be aware of the world on the level they are aware of it is because they need those things in order to survive. Now, when you get to the human level, we are capable of reason, of abstract thought, because we don't just act in a world of three-dimensional entities. We also act across time. We predict the future. We act long range. That's what abstraction allows us to do. And the concomitant pleasure-pain mechanism there is our higher emotions. We feel tragic sorrow. We feel exaltation and heroism and reverence. Why do we feel these things? Animals can't feel those. They can feel pleasure and pain. They can feel some basic emotions like fear, joy. They don't feel these higher emotions human beings can. Why? Because those emotions are a result of our being able to think in abstract terms. They are what motivate our abstract, long-range action. Now, in just the same way as if you take away the need for an animal to move around, it will become a vegetable because it doesn't need to feel pleasure and pain. It doesn't need to be aware. A human being will lose his capacity to feel happiness, to feel all of the greatest emotions he can, which are the purpose of life. These highest, most exalted states of existence. That's the purpose of life. But in order to feel those, you have to act like a human being. You have to think abstractly and act on your own in a world of entities. Now, if the government comes in, if other people come in and tell you what to do, they are preventing you, forcibly preventing you from thinking abstractly and acting on those abstract thoughts. But it is precisely that is what allows you to experience happiness and all of the highest emotions. This is why freedom is necessary for human flourishing. Because individuals think, there's no collective mind. Individuals act, there's no collective organism. Because if you have a system that forcibly thinks and acts for an individual, you are removing his need for happiness as an existential entity. And so he's going to lose it. Everybody understands, use it or lose it. Your muscles atrophy if you don't use them. All of your capacities atrophy if you don't use them. Everyone understands. You enjoy something because there was a possibility you couldn't get it, because it was up to you, right? You ever play a video game like an RPG, and you take joy in the fact that you got to make a choice, a moral choice in the game, even though you think nobody would have chosen that other option, it was stupid, and maybe 99% of people do choose the option you chose. But it doesn't matter, because in fact the choice was there and you had to make it. If you take that away, you're not going to feel pleasure in that choice because there was no choice. You have to be free to make your own choices, to take your own actions. Otherwise, there's no reward for successfully achieving life. Everyone understands this in concrete terms. You just have to understand the profound implications of it. Everyone understands if you just get handed something, you don't value it. Look, plants don't act. Animals act across space. Human beings act across space and time. Now, if you take away an animal's need to act across space, then it loses the pleasure-pain mechanism that motivates it to act across space. And if you take away a human being's need to act across time, which means his need to think for himself abstractly, then you take away his ability to feel happiness, because he doesn't need it anymore, because he doesn't need to think abstractly. So he needs no motivation or reward for thinking abstractly. That's what this boils down to. Consciousness exists as a tool of survival, and our experiences, our positive and negative valence experiences, our good and bad experiences, our pleasures and pains, our sorrows and joys, those are motivations to act successfully. But if somebody comes in and forces us to act, even if they force us to do what is in our own self-interest, it isn't in our own self-interest because it was forced on us. We have to choose it for it to actually be valuable to us. But the alt-right doesn't understand this. They make the same mistake all collectivists, all people who advocate force for the greater good make. And it's the idea that you can have an intrinsic value, that there are values out there, and since there are values, you can just force them on people. No, there are right and wrong choices and values, but they aren't values if people don't choose them. You can't be happy if somebody else is forcing you to act a certain way, and there's no point in living if you can't be happy. And that is why happiness and life depend on freedom.
Your argument boils down to might makes right, Richard.
Ultimately, these collective entities are going to have power over
That's
individuals.
the point of a human right. That's the point of an individualist system, to constrain the power of groups.
Fiction. It's a value that you want to live in such a society in which we grant individuals rights. That's what you're effectively saying.
Can
it's
I
not
ask
like there's
one,
an actual
can I ask a
human
question?
right
We
that
live in
exists
These
in
things
some
we
form.
grant to ourselves, and we must
Yeah,
guard
but
them.
I am
Let's hear
cutting
what
through
Styx has to say.
And this is why Sargon can't defeat the alt-right. There are two historical answers to the question of rights among people who believe in them in some sense. One is they come from God. Now, if you know what's wrong with God, you know what's wrong with rights based on God or anything supernatural. The other view is what Sargon just said. Look, we grant them to ourselves. Well, the proper rejoinder to that is exactly what Spencer said. All you're saying is you want to live in a world with rights. So what? What's the objective basis for it? How do you justify that? That's just a feeling. That's just an emotion. That's just your subjective desire. You have no grounds for that. Show me the grounds for it. Spencer is taking advantage of the fact that we have never, until Ayn Rand, had a solid proof of individual rights, even a proper conception of what they are. But people have basically agreed not to touch this pillar too much because civilization depends on it. Well, Spencer's just coming along and pushing, and he's saying this is all a fairy tale. People just go along with it. I'm not going along with it, and that makes him seem like an honest truth teller who just isn't going along with the fiction everybody else is. It's the emperor's new clothes. Spencer is just coming along and honestly saying, look, nobody has given a good defense of this, so there must not be any actual basis for rights. So why shouldn't collectives just come and tell you what to do? This is why he thinks in terms of might makes right. To him, what does it even mean to say that something is a right? All it can mean is that someone has the ability to do something. If I can stab Richard Spencer in the throat, I have the right to. In a certain sense, he's being more honest than everyone else who talks about this. He's reality-oriented. He's looking for what's the basis of rights. And nobody's giving him a reality orientation, so he's looking and he's saying, well, rights must refer to something in reality, and the only thing I see in reality is what people do. So if somebody has the power to do something, that must be all rights refer to if they refer to anything. Well, Sargon has no answer to that. No one but objectivists do. And the answer is what I said before, of course, that rights are based on cause and effect relationships. If you do this, you get this outcome, and you don't want that outcome for self-evident reasons. That's ultimately the basis of rights. Happiness is a self-evident value, and there's certain courses of action that lead to happiness in a social setting, certain rules that lead to human flourishing, that lead to this self-evident value, and that's why you shouldn't do some of the things you could do, because doing those things has objective consequences. Now, you can do the different things, but you can't escape the consequences of doing them. And some of those consequences are self-evidently what we should go after, and some aren't. It's as simple as that.
The whole point, Richard, well, I mean, read Common Sense by Thomas Paine. That is, like, you can see exactly, they know what they're doing with the American Revolution. I mean, he sits there and plans out, like, the tonnage of the ships required and the materials required to build these in order to put these values into practice. Like, the idea that you think this is a retroactive thing is just wrong.
No, it was an attempt to legitimize actions that were taken that were political actions.
The ideas came first, the actions came second.
Oh, so they read philosophy and then they decided to create the United States.
That's exactly how it worked.
Keep dreaming.
Have you read Common Sense by Thomas Paine? Have you read any of these things?
Yes.
And how can you sit there and say that that's not the case?
Because I don't buy into this fairy tale of Americanism, which you unfortunately do.
I get it.
Denial of a fairy tale, yes.
If you want, but that doesn't make them not true.
Both of you will disagree. Woz, did you want to weigh in?
I think it's absurd to suggest that the people fighting that war, the majority of them understood the philosophical underpinnings. I think there were far more real-world motivations there.
Well, unlike Millennial Woes here, that's the person who just spoke at the end there, unlike him, the people of that time understood the relationship between philosophy and the real world. Now, it also happens to be the case that Millennial Woes is simply historically ignorant. It's well known that the Americans at the time of the founding era, the common people, had a shockingly high literacy rate. It was above 90, I think. And they actually were reading Locke and the Founding Fathers. Everyone knew these people. These people actually were motivated by ideas. I mean, you can just look this up in history books. Millennial Woes is just pulling this out of thin air based on his stupid philosophy. That, well, people aren't motivated by ideas, therefore it's ridiculous that they were at the time. Well, actually, philosophically, they are motivated by ideas, and historically, that's an actual fact if you care to look it up and not just pull BS out of nowhere. But there's also a pretty funny contradiction here if you actually listen to what they said. They went into a little more of this later, which might have made it clearer, but I didn't want to have a bunch of repetitive clips here. So Spencer says that Jefferson and the other founding fathers didn't actually believe in the ideas they implemented. They were just cynically appealing to Enlightenment ideas in order to legitimize the state in the eyes of who? Well, as Ayn Rand would say, blank out. But worse than blank out here. So in Richard Spencer's view, Jefferson and the other founding fathers didn't actually believe in these Enlightenment ideas. They were just cynically putting them in there in order to legitimize the state, which apparently they wanted to create for the same tribal, geographic reasons people have wanted to create states throughout history. They were just using this to legitimize the state, legitimize it in the eyes of the people who, according to millennial woes, don't know about or believe in Enlightenment philosophy anyway. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, Jefferson didn't really believe it. He was just doing it to make it palatable to people, but those people also didn't care about the philosophy either. Well, somebody cared. Even if you think the founding fathers were cynical, somebody cared enough and was important enough for them to have to rationalize it. The most significant point he could be making is that Thomas Jefferson or some of the particular founding fathers were cynical and didn't actually believe what they were saying. Now, that's wrong, but even if it were right, that doesn't have any implications because ideas are still the driving factor here, even if they're just rationalizations. Well, if you need rationalizations for something, then the rationalizations make the difference. Now, good ideas are not just rationalizations. It's true, evil philosophies are rationalizations, but that's how they have their impact. They still make the difference. But yes, this is stupid. Ideas drive history and people's lives. Now, it's easy not to think this way. If you are a racist, alt-right, cretin, coward who hasn't thought for himself throughout his life and is therefore attracted to these collectivist ideas, if you're somebody like that, then it would seem implausible to you, as it does to millennial woes, that I don't think these people believed in ideas, understood the philosophy, and were motivated by it. Well, that's projection there. I can say without ever having met him that he is a coward who has not taken control of his own life. Because it's obvious to anyone who has that the conclusions he comes to dictate his actions. And even before he chose his ideas consciously, whatever ideas were put on him by random association dictated his actions. Now, you only understand this once you start to take charge. And then you see the difference. Oh, I see what's motivating me. I see how this is working. But if you never have, then of course it seems implausible. Oh, well, ideas drive people? They're not what drive me. I just do whatever I feel like, I guess. I just go with my urges or what my genes tell me or what society tells me. That's, yeah, when you hear people defending anything other than ideas as the cause of history, what they're actually saying is, I don't think for myself and I just kind of go along with whatever I feel like and what other people tell me to do. That's why it seems so implausible to them that ideas drive history, because they have never had the courage to examine what is driving themselves and to choose what will drive them. History is nothing but a proof of the fact that ideas determine everything. If you're just basically acquainted with history, you can see this. It's like a laboratory experiment. So let's see, is it just a coincidence that when Greek and specifically Aristotelian philosophy left Europe and went to the Islamic world, that Europe fell into the Dark Ages and the Islamic world had its golden age? And then when the Muslims rejected Greek philosophy with Al-Ghazali and they turned back to mysticism, pure mysticism, they fell to what they are now. And as soon as Europe picked Aristotle back up through Thomas Aquinas, injecting it into the Christian world, into Catholicism, where it became their standard philosophy, that the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment happened? Is this what explains that? Genes, the relatively static genes these people had for a few thousand years? No, that's idiotic. Any honest person can look at history, and just like with anything else, it's just an isolation of variables. It's just an experiment. It's just the scientific method. Okay, what was the difference that made the difference? What's the independent variable here? What's the dependent variable? Well, the independent variable is ideas, and the dependent variable is the nature of the civilization, the level of the civilization. And oh, weird, When we tweak the ideas, the nature and level and prosperity of the civilization seems to change. It seems to vary concomitantly with the change in ideas. Weird. No, it's not weird. That just shows that ideas are the cause of history and of the courses of people's individual lives. Anyway, those are the most important things I wanted to say about this stream. So thanks for listening, and I will see you in the next video.